And that is kind of closing the loop, starting with the research perspective and taking the administrative and regulative positions now. We close the morning session by a presentation from Christina Rudén from the Stockholm University, representing a huge research cluster that has been going on for 8 years, has been concluded last fall. MistraPharma, and has come, that's one of the unique research projects that actually has come with concrete or specific policy recommendations. Welcome, Christina Rudén.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us. As Nikolai said, I coordinated the research program MistraPharma that did run for 8 years in Sweden, but was finalized in December of last year. But at the end of the program, the researchers agreed on a number of recommendations on how to improve environmental risk assessment on pharmaceuticals, and that's what I will present to you briefly today. Okay, so this is MistraPharma in brief, as I said, 8 years. The research partners, Umeå University, Stockholm University, Uppsala, KTH, University of Gothenburg, and Brunel University in London. And I'm happy to see some of my research colleagues here today as well. MistraPharma was not only a research program, we also had an extensive network in our reference group and also a board representing major stakeholders. So the research we did was very much done in collaboration with the stakeholders in Sweden. We present our recommendation in a paper published in the peer-reviewed literature. It's open access, so if you Google it, you will find it on the web. And we also presented it, a short version, as a policy brief, which is available on our website, mistrapharma.se. So what we did was to look at everything we knew about the environmental risks with pharmaceuticals. We looked at the EU environmental objectives and the Swedish environmental objectives, and we compared it to the guidance and the rules for environmental risk assessment and tried to find weaknesses. So we build our recommendations on the results that we received during our the natural science research on pharmaceuticals in the environment, both on the effect side, the occurrence side, and also from technical solutions, the treatment options. We also did reviews of the available environmental risk assessments and also looked at the available legislations, and not only the recommendations and rules for pharmaceuticals, but also for other types of chemicals that are regulated within the EU, such as industrial chemicals and plant protection products and biocidal products. So I will go through our 10 recommendations. I will focus on the what, why, and how, and I will not focus so much on the challenges and obstacles involved in these processes. If you're interested, the details are in our published paper. There is no prioritization in the order of the recommendation, so it's not like the most important comes first. It's more like a logical order relating to the risk assessment process. And the complexity and controversies around the recommendations also differ. So for some there are quite a lot of consensus and could be relatively easy to do, and others are more controversial and more complex if you were to implement them. So first of all, the requirement to make an environmental risk assessment for pharmaceuticals only applies to products registered after 2006, when the new rules were implemented. So this is a very pragmatic approach to introducing new rules. You exempt those that are already on the market. And that has been used previously for instance, for industrial chemicals when those rules were new. So this is, as I said, a pragmatic approach that is not based on science or a risk assessment. We have no reason to believe that older substances are less risky or less hazardous than new substances. So we think that should be changed. We need environmental data and risk assessment for all pharmaceutical products. And how to do that is that we need to rewrite the scope of the guideline. Our second recommendation is to add requirements to assess the risk of development for antibiotic resistance, and that has been discussed this morning already. Antibiotic resistance is a major and global health concern that is currently not covered by the environmental risk assessment of pharmaceuticals, even though that more and more information is emerging that actually pharmaceuticals or antibiotics in the environment can contribute to the development of antibiotic resistance. So we should include this dimension to the risk assessment. And there are also methods emerging or being proposed now for how to do that, to define minimal selective concentrations, which is sort of the concentrations that would drive or actually not drive then the emergence of antibiotic resistance. And there's also methods how to do that that has been partly worked out by Joachim and his colleagues. The rules now say that we need to do an environmental risk assessment per product, and there can be several products that contain the same active pharmaceutical ingredient or API. So this results in that there may be several different risk assessments for one and the same active pharmaceutical ingredient. And that, of course, means that we duplicate work, which is unnecessary. And to the extent that these risk assessments actually differ in the conclusions, it might also be a problem when we discuss potential risk management measures. This problem with several producers of the same substance was also discussed heavily with the implementation of the REACH regulation for industrial chemicals. So in that legislation, there are strict rules that companies need to collaborate, and also how they should do that, to form consortia, to divide tasks of gathering information, and how people that join the consortium need to pay for it. So we think that that would be feasible also in the pharmaceutical area. Our fourth recommendation is to refine the tiered approach for testing. Regulatory risk assessment is to some extent a one-size-fits-all exercise. There is a kind of a tiered approach for environmental risk assessment of pharmaceuticals, but we think that this can be further developed. And the idea behind this is that we should put testing focus and testing efforts to the really problematic compounds, and then there might be others that we can allow to be not so thoroughly tested. And that is also a way to make use of all available knowledge, including the extensive testing and research that is done during drug development. So the work that we have done is to see that the predicted environmental concentration that goes into the risk assessment is not always sufficient. Bioconcentration experiments show that sometimes these compounds, they bioconcentrate more than expected and sometimes less than expected. So we think to supplement the PEC approach with a simplified bioconcentration study could be significantly improve the process. And then we also have good information from the drug development process about what concentrations that would actually trigger the pharmacological response, and we can use a read-across approach to improve environmental risk assessment by that as well. Another problem is test selection, and that has also been mentioned here already today, that pharmaceuticals are not toxic in the traditional sense. So the old toxicity studies developed for industrial chemicals are not always relevant for these very special types of molecules. So sometimes we need to also consider to test in relation to the mode of action or the pharmacological mode of action expected for the different substances. So we need to tailor the substances depending on the pharmacology of the molecule. Our fifth recommendation is to perform mixture toxicity assessment on active pharmaceutical ingredients with similar mode of action. Look, we are competing with the EU Commission with using abbreviations and acronyms here. API is active pharmaceutical ingredients, and the MOA is mode of action. Well, it's well known that chemicals that act in a similar way, they would also the effects will add to each other when we are exposed to them similarly at the same time. So if we only make a risk assessment for one substance at a time, we will underestimate the risk. And this is a major problem, not just for pharmaceuticals in the environment, but also for all the chemicals that we use on the market today, namely like 30 to 50,000 different chemicals that can interact in these ways. And it's increasingly acknowledged that this is a problem and that it seriously underestimates the risk with chemical exposure, but we don't have any clear use of mixture risk assessment today in the regulatory arena, but what we do have is suggestions for how it could be done. So we have models how to do this, like the concentration addition model, which basically says that if they act in a similar way, we can add their toxicity to each other in a particular modeling effort. Others have proposed basically to use a mixture assessment factor, like we do use assessment factors for other uncertainties and variabilities in the risk assessment process. So there are suggestions here, but as I said, no one has, with a few exemptions, of regulatory implementations. Our sixth recommendation is to mandate use of all available ecotoxicity studies. In the guidance for environmental risk assessment of pharmaceuticals, standard studies according to, for instance, OECD test guidelines is recommended by the authorities. But now when we have increasingly available experimental studies also from the academia, we think that the system should be really open for using also those studies. The underlying problem, as I said, is that the old standard test guideline studies were basically developed for industrial chemicals and are not always the best for testing pharmaceuticals with a particular pharmacological mode of action. So these chemicals can cause effects that is not covered. The endpoints are not covered by the traditional toxicity tests, like behavioral tests and effects on feeding rates, for instance, would never be covered by a standard test, but can easily, or not easily, but it can be covered by non-standard academic research. So by expanding the scope of what tests that can be included in the environmental risk assessment, we can fill important data gaps and get new information into the process. And this is also allowed in other regulatory areas, like for industrial chemicals, for instance, and the biocides regulation. So that could be done by actually saying that in the risk assessment we need to take into account the peer-reviewed literature. We need to then also would be facilitated by a way to evaluate all the available non-standard data, and there are also proposals from the MistraPharma consortium on how to do that, a method for how to do that in a systematic and transparent way. And it would also help document the process so others can see what has happened during this risk assessment and evaluate it. Our seventh recommendation is to include environmental risks in the risk-benefit analysis. As you probably know, environmental data can be used in the process for not approving a market approval or for veterinary products, but not for human pharmaceuticals. And that the regulatory agencies don't really emphasize the submission of data for environmental risk assessment, and this has led to that the environmental risk assessment often comes late, and that they are not complete. So there are important deficiencies in the environmental risk assessment. And this is a controversial proposal, but but some argue at least that a severe risk for environmental effects should be a reason for denying market approval, in particular when there are many other alternatives already available, so that the needs of patients can still be taken care of, so to speak. Because I think everyone agree that we should not, that patient is an important factor in this. So, in order to sort of increase the status of the environmental risk assessment, there need probably to be some consequences if the industry does not comply with the requirements. And as I said, we could consider denial of market approval if we have good alternatives already available that are not environmentally problematic. Our eighth recommendation is to require review of the environmental risk assessment at regular intervals. So this is currently lacking, which I think is a really strange thing, because new knowledge emerge all the time. Knowledge about toxicity, knowledge about exposure, monitoring, as we have discussed here earlier today, and those data need to be included in the risk assessment continuously. And this is applied in other legislations. So in REACH, the industry should update the risk assessment when significant new information becomes available on a regular basis. In other regulations, that we have time intervals, like for every 5th or every 10th year. So our ninth recommendation is to include data on emissions from production in an environmental risk assessment. So we have heard a lot about this already today, that we have a problem with the highest environmental concentrations found around production, and that we need to apply a life cycle perspective on these pharmaceuticals. So it's not a solution for us to have problems, environmental problems in other parts of the world, that we need to take responsibility for that. And again, there are approaches suggested on how to do that with environmental quality standard type of approaches. And probably we need to supplement this and such an effort to mitigate this with some sort of consequences if these rules were violated. And finally, our last recommendation is to increase transparency in the process, and that has to do both with the production, where and how are our pharmaceuticals produced, and also the environmental risk assessment and the data associated with those. Now it's really difficult to get information about the environmental risk assessment. There are some summaries available, but no data, and of course production information about production sites is lacking. There is still a scarcity of data, and it is important that the data and information that is out there become available. It's important for scientists, it's important for the society to make use of this information. It's also for the credibility of the environmental risk assessment and the regulation that it can actually be evaluated by third parties. And it also hinders that we duplicate work. So if we don't know that the industry already made a lot of tests, and then we might spend taxpayers' money of doing research on studies that were already made. So there are several reasons to actually increase transparency in this. And for instance, within the REACH regulation, industry data is, at least to some extent, published online and available on the ECHA web page. And other sectors has also been moving towards more transparency when it comes to productions, for instance. So a database hosted online might be one, similar to the REACH system. The MistraPharma program has the WikiPharma database, where we have gathered effects data for pharmaceuticals in the environment. So that's also available free of charge online. WikiPharma, you can reach it by our homepage. So both, and we want both, as I said, experimental data, monitoring data, and preferably also information about production sites. And with that, I've come to the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's really an honor to have the program leader of the MistraPharma here with us today. And I would like to start to ask you a very difficult question. Which of the recommendations is most acute to finish? And to start?
I was actually thinking that you would ask me that, and that is a really difficult question. But I thought one possible approach to that, if we listen to the Commission, we listen to the Swedish agencies, responsible agencies, and we listen to what the scientists here recommend, we can see a certain overlap in the recommendations and the proposed ways forward. And I think one way to start is really to deal with the low-hanging fruits. So where most or all of the stakeholders actually agree that we can move forward, we can take decisions, we can not just take steps but make jumps, as someone said. So that's one approach, actually.
So in areas where we already have some momentum.
Why don't we start there? Maybe we have also heard that it's really difficult to actually sort of quantify the risk. What is the most important? Where would be the best bang for the bucks or whatever? So therefore I think maybe we could start with where we mostly agree and take the first steps or jumps ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have one more question. I know it's lunchtime already, but I would like to, you have a long career in research of in many different kind of chemicals, and when you now 6 months after MistraPharma was finished, and you have a more perspective, the main differences in between this field and other fields, like for chemical substances, industrial substances.
Yes, I worked mostly with industrial chemicals and the REACH legislation for many years. But I think it's a huge difference. At least here in Sweden, we have had such an extraordinary climate when it comes to dialogue between the different stakeholders. So within the MistraPharma network, we have had sort of all the major stakeholders, including the industry, and we have worked really constructively with these questions. And I would say in a majority of the issues, most stakeholders actually do agree, and that is not common practice if we look at industrial chemicals, where there is a tradition with a lot of controversy and naysayers among the industry, for instance. And I don't perceive that being the problem in this area. I think here if I can be a little bit critical, we lack political initiatives. There are all these proposals and the recommendations and a lot of agreement among the major stakeholders, but the politicians seem slow to react. So that would be also my take-home message. It's time to jump.
More debate articles, maybe.
Maybe, I don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christina.
Thank you.